The air in the Beeline Cafe hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of stale cigarette smoke, burnt coffee, and the sweet, greasy perfume of frying bacon. It was early October, 1974. Outside, a pale autumn sun was trying its best to burn through the morning haze that lay over the flat black dirt of McLean County, Illinois. Inside, the usual jury of retired farmers and off-duty mechanics held court from their worn vinyl stools at the counter, solving the world's problems one cup of lukewarm coffee at a time. I was in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of my own, trying to get the taste of yesterday's diesel fuel off the back of my tongue. I was Earl Miller, 42 years old, with hands that looked more like gnarled oak roots than flesh and bone, and a face the sun and wind had been carving on for 3 decades. My farm, the one my father had bought with cash after the Great War and handed to me free and clear, was a modest 320 acres. Half a section. Not much by the new standards, but it was mine. Every last fence post, the screen door whined open and slapped shut, and in strode Richard Peterson. You couldn't miss him. Even in a room full of farmers, Rich stood out. He wasn't wearing dusty overalls or a sweat-stained seed corn cap. He had on a clean pair of Wrangler jeans, creased sharp enough to cut twine, and a pearl snap shirt that looked like it had never seen a grease gun. He was 10 years younger than me, with a confident smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a way of walking that announced he owned any room he entered, or at least had a bank note on it. He grabbed a stool at the counter, and the conversation shifted toward him like iron filings to a magnet. He'd just taken delivery of his new combine, a John Deere 7700 Turbo, the biggest, meanest machine in the county. It had a 6-row corn head, a 20-foot grain table, and a cab with air conditioning and a radio. An honest-to-God, factory-installed 8-track tape player. "She's a beauty, boys," Rich declared, loud enough for me to hear him clearly over in my booth. "Dealer just dropped her off yesterday. We fired her up, and that diesel just purrs. 6-cylinder turbo. Barely even notice the load when you engage the separator." Old man Hemlock, who'd farmed with horses before he'd farmed with a John Deere A, grunted. "What'd a rig like that set you back, Richie?" Rich waved a dismissive hand, like the money was an inconvenience. "Let's just say the bank was happy to see me. You gotta spend money to make money, Harold. Get big or get out." That's what the man from the university said. He took a sip of the coffee the waitress set in front of him, and then, as if on cue, his eyes found mine across the room. He gave me that thin smile. "Speaking of which," he said, his voice carrying again, "Earl, you get that old Massey of yours pieced together for this year? Or are you going to have to hire it done?" The chatter at the counter died down. Every eye turned to me. They all knew my machine, a 1968 Massey Harris 510. It was a good combine in its day, a real workhorse. But next to Rich's new green monster, it looked like something out of a museum. It had an open operator's station, a 4-cylinder Perkins diesel that sounded more like a cement mixer than an engine, and a grain tank that Rich's new Deere could fill in 2 passes. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering. I didn't like being the center of attention, especially when the attention felt like a hawk circling a chicken. "She'll be ready, Rich," I said, my voice low and even. "Always is." He chuckled. It was a condescending sound. "Ready for what, Earl? A garden patch? Corn's running 200 bushel to the acre this year. The stalks are thick as my arm. That old combine can't handle this. The cylinder's not big enough. The straw walkers will plug up every 10 feet. You'll be leaving a trail of shelled corn on the ground, so thick the birds won't have to fly south for the winter." A few of the men at the counter snickered. They weren't being mean, not really. They were just caught up in the tide. Rich was the future. He was progress. He had the shiny new iron and the backing of the Farmers and Merchants Bank. I was a relic, a stubborn man clinging to his father's ways while the world moved on. "My Massey doesn't leave much on the ground," I said, setting my cup down with a soft click. "I set the concave clearance and the fan speed just right. It's about the operator, not just the machine." Rich laughed out loud this time. "The operator? Earl, my new 7700 could be run by a trained monkey. It's got electronic sensors, for God's sake. Tells you the shaft speeds, the grain loss. All you got to do is steer and listen to Johnny Cash on the 8-track. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter, his voice dropping into a mock sympathetic tone. "I'm just saying, don't be too proud to ask for help when that thing breaks down in the middle of the field and there's rain coming. I might be able to fit you in after I finish my 1,000 acres." The implication hung in the air thicker than the cigarette smoke. He wasn't just bragging about his machine, he was telling the whole town he was a success, and I was a failure. That his debt was a sign of ambition, and my solvency was a sign of cowardice. I pushed a dollar bill under my saucer, stood up, and put on my cap. I walked toward the door, and as I passed the counter, I stopped and looked Rich Peterson right in the eye. "I appreciate the offer, Rich," I said, keeping my voice as calm as a windless morning. "But I think I'll manage. You just worry about making those bank payments. I hear interest rates are on the move." I didn't wait for a reply. I pushed the screen door open and stepped out into the cool, clean air, leaving the laughter and the smell of burnt coffee behind me. The challenge had been laid down, not with fists, but with horsepower and bushels per acre and the cold, hard numbers on a bank loan. And as I walked to my dusty Ford pickup, I knew this harvest was going to be about more than just corn. Before we go any further with this story, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Rich Peterson? The kind of fellow who mistakes a bank loan for a harvest, who thinks the shine on the paint is more important than the sweat on his brow. Let me know down in the comments, because I'd bet every farm town in America has at least one. They're the first ones to tell you you're doing it all wrong, and usually the first ones to get a visit from the auctioneer when the tide goes out. The walk from the truck to the machine shed was a familiar one. The gravel crunched under my boots in a rhythm I'd known since I was a boy. The shed itself wasn't much to look at. It was an old pole barn my father and I had put up in the 50s, with corrugated steel siding that was starting to show freckles of rust where the galvanizing had worn thin. But inside, it was my sanctuary. It smelled of cold steel, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, earthy scent of last year's dust. And there she was, sitting in the center bay, waiting. The Massey Harris 510. Her red paint was faded to a dull, sun-baked orange, and the white lettering on the grain tank was cracked and peeling. But to me, she was beautiful. She was honest. There wasn't a single piece of plastic on her, save for the seat cushion I'd replaced a few years back. She was all steel and iron and grease. Rich's words were still ringing in my ears. That old combine can't handle this. Maybe he was right. The corn was heavier than I'd ever seen it. The stalks were tough and green, full of moisture. It would be a true test. But this machine and I, we had an understanding. I took care of her, and she took care of me. I spent the next 3 days living in that shed. My wife, Martha, would bring my lunch and dinner out on a tray, shaking her head with a little smile, knowing better than to try and pull me away. This was my ritual, my communion with the machine before the Battle of Harvest began. I started at the front, with the 4-row corn head. I pulled every gathering chain, checking for stiff links, cleaning out the packed-in dirt and debris from the sprockets. I used a wire brush and a can of diesel fuel, my knuckles getting scraped and black with grease. I checked the snapping rolls, making sure the clearance was just right. Too wide, and they'd shell the ears. Too tight, and they'd crush the stalks and send the whole mess into the machine. I laid a straight edge across them, adjusting the shims until they were perfect, a gap no wider than a nickel. Then I moved to the guts of the combine. I climbed up onto the frame and opened the big inspection door on the side, revealing the cylinder and concave. This was the heart of the machine, where the grain was separated from the cob. Rich's Deere had a heavy, high-speed cylinder that beat the grain out. My Massey used a different principle. It was a lower-speed, rasp bar cylinder that was designed to roll the ears along the concave, gently rubbing the kernels off. It was slower, but it was gentler on the grain. Less cracking, less damage. The rasp bars were worn. I'd noticed it at the end of last year's soybean harvest. I'd bought a new set back in February, and they were leaning against the wall, heavy and grey and smelling of new steel. Changing them was a miserable job. I had to crawl halfway, inside the combine, into a space meant for corn stalks, not a grown man. The bolts were rusted tight. I soaked them in penetrating oil for an hour, then went at them with a 3/4-inch breaker bar, my knuckles screaming every time the wrench slipped. One bolt, the last one, refused to budge. I put a 4-foot cheetah pipe on the end of the breaker bar, braced my feet against the frame, and pulled until I felt a tremor run through my shoulders and down my spine. There was a sudden, sickening crack. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I'd snapped the head off the bolt, a disaster that would mean hours with a drill and a tap. But then I saw it. The bolt had broken free. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I spent the next 4 hours lying on my back with rust and dirt falling in my eyes, fitting the new bars, torquing each bolt to the precise specification in the worn, grease-stained operator's manual. Next came the straw walkers, 4 long, oscillating wooden frames with metal grates. Their job was to sift the last of the free kernels out of the mass of leaves and stalks before it was thrown out the back. I climbed into the back of the combine, a space even tighter than the cylinder housing. I checked every wooden slat for cracks, every bearing for play. The second walker from the left had a slight wobble. The bearing was shot. This was the kind of problem that sent men like Rich Peterson to the phone to call the dealer. For me, it meant a trip to the workbench. I pulled the bearing assembly, a heavy chunk of cast iron holding a sealed bearing. I didn't have a new one. The parts store was closed. But I had my father's old press, a hoard of salvaged bearings in coffee cans, and a belief that anything made by man could be fixed by man. I found a bearing from an old water pump that had the same outer diameter. The inner diameter was a 1/16 of an inch too small. So I went to work. I clamped the bearing in the vise, and with a rat-tail file and a bottle of cutting oil, I began the painstaking process of hand-filing the inner race. It was slow, tedious work, stroke after stroke, measuring with a caliper, wiping away the metal filings, adding more oil. It took 2 hours, but when I was done, the bearing slid onto the shaft with a snug, perfect fit. I packed it with high-temperature grease and pressed it back into its housing. It was a fix that cost me nothing but time and sweat, a currency I had in greater supply than cash. Day after day, I worked my way through the machine. I greased over 80 Zerk fittings, forcing fresh red grease in until the old black stuff squeezed out. I checked the tension on every belt and every chain, from the main separator drive to the little chain that ran the grain elevator. I found a weak spot in one of the canvas drapers on the grain platform, a small tear that would become a giant rip under load. I sat on an upturned bucket with a heavy needle and a spool of waxed thread, stitching a patch of old belting over the tear, my calloused fingers clumsy but sure. Finally, it was time to wake the engine. The Perkins 4236 diesel, not a powerhouse, but as reliable as the sunrise. I checked the oil and the coolant. I bled the fuel lines, cracking the injector nuts one by one until a clear stream of diesel fuel squirted out, a sign there was no air in the system. I climbed up to the operator's station, a simple metal seat with a steering wheel and a few levers. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the cold engine over slowly. 1 revolution. 2. Then it caught. A cloud of black smoke billowed out of the short, straight exhaust pipe, and the whole machine began to shake and vibrate as the engine settled into a rough, clattering idle. It wasn't the smooth purr of Rich's new turbo diesel. It was the sound of work. It was the sound of power that had been paid for, not borrowed. I let it warm up for 10 minutes, watching the oil pressure gauge, listening for any wrong notes in the mechanical symphony. It sounded healthy. It sounded ready. As I climbed down, wiping my greasy hands on a red rag, I saw Rich Peterson's new pickup truck slow down as it passed my farm on the county road. He didn't stop, but I saw him look over, his eyes taking in my old Massey sitting there in the yard. I could see the smirk on his face, even from 100 yards away. He shook his head and sped up, kicking up a cloud of dust. He saw a pile of old iron. I saw a partner, a tool I knew inside and out. The race was on. The boom years of the mid-70s were a strange time. It felt like the whole world had decided to get rich, and farming was the fastest way to do it. Grain prices, which had been steady for as long as I could remember, suddenly shot for the moon. The Russians were buying millions of tons of our corn and wheat, a deal they called détente, and we called the Great Grain Robbery. The Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butts, was on the radio telling us to plant fence row to fence row. Get bigger, he said. Expand. The government was guaranteeing loans, and the banks were handing out money like it was free candy at a parade. For a man like Rich Peterson, it was paradise. He had the new equipment, the big acreage he'd rented, and an appetite for risk that made the bankers swoon. That harvest of 74, he was a machine. His big John Deere 7700 ran day and night. You could see its stadium lights moving across the fields long after the sun went down, a relentless green monster gobbling up corn. He finished his 1,000 acres in a week and a half. The line of his trucks at the co-op elevator was a testament to his success. He was the talk of the town, the new king of the county. The Beeline Cafe buzzed with stories of his yields, his speed, his ambition. My harvest was a different story. The Massey ran well, the bearing I'd fixed held perfectly. The new rasp bars shelled the corn clean as a whistle. But I was slow. I could only run 4 rows at a time to his 6. My grain tank was smaller, so I had to stop to unload into the wagon more often. I didn't have lights bright enough to run safely after dark, so when the sun went down, I went home. It took me nearly 3 weeks to finish my 320 acres. To the rest of the county, it looked like I was falling even further behind. They saw Rich's sprint and my slow, steady plodding, and they drew their own conclusions. But they didn't see what I saw. I'd walk my fields after the Massey had gone through, and the ground was clean. A few kernels here and there, but nothing more. One afternoon, out of curiosity, I drove over and walked a field Rich had just finished. The ground was littered with shelled corn. His big, aggressive machine, running at high speed to cover the acres, was throwing a fortune out the back. I did a quick count in a square-foot area and did the math. He was losing 5, maybe 6 bushels to the acre. Across 1,000 acres, that was enough to make a down payment on a new pickup truck. He was moving fast, but he was leaking money with every pass. Both of us made good money that year. The price at the elevator was the highest it had ever been. Rich's year was spectacular. He paid off his operating loan and still had a mountain of cash left over. He did exactly what the experts were telling him to do. He leveraged. The Henderson farm, 160 acres of prime, flat black dirt that bordered my own property, came up for sale when old man Henderson passed away. The land auction was a spectacle. Rich Peterson, flush with cash and confidence, got into a bidding war with an investor from Chicago. The price went up and up to a number that made my stomach clench. It was more than land had ever been worth, more than it could ever hope to pay for itself with corn. Rich won. He strode out of that auction hall like a conquering hero. A week later, a brand new John Deere 4630 tractor was delivered to his farm. It was a beast with an enclosed cab, air conditioning, and big dual tires on the back. He'd traded in his 4430, which was only 2 years old. He was building an empire on a foundation of debt, and everyone, from the banker to the boys at the cafe, was cheering him on. He was a visionary. I had a good year, too. A very good year. After I sold my grain, I had more money in my checking account than I'd ever seen. Martha and I talked about what to do with it. We could have bought a new car. We could have taken a real vacation, gone to Florida. We could have traded in the Massey for a newer, bigger model. The dealer was practically begging me to. Instead, I drove into town and went to the bank. I paid off the small operating loan I'd taken for seed and fertilizer. Then I walked over to the hardware store and ordered enough new steel siding and roofing to redo the machine shed. I paid in cash. I took the rest, a substantial sum, and put it into a simple savings account. Mr. Henderson, the bank president, called me into his office. "Earl," he said, leaning back in his big leather chair, "you had a tremendous year. Congratulations. But this," he tapped my savings account book, "is not the place for your money right now. 5% interest. Inflation is running at 12%. You're losing money every day it sits here." "It feels safe there, Mr. Henderson," I said. "Safe isn't how you get ahead," he said, his voice full of passion. "Look at Rich Peterson. He's using his assets. He's using our money to make more money. That land he just bought will be worth double in 5 years. You have 320 acres, free and clear. That's a gold mine of collateral, Earl. We could lend you enough to buy a new combine, a new tractor, rent another 500 acres. You're missing the opportunity of a lifetime." I just nodded. "I appreciate the advice, sir, but I think I'll just sleep on it." I walked out of the bank feeling like a fool. Every expert, every voice of authority was telling me I was wrong. They saw my discipline as fear. They saw my savings as a wasted opportunity. Rich was the man of the hour, and I was the dinosaur waiting for the meteor. That winter, as I was nailing the new steel sheets onto the side of my machine shed, the wind cold and sharp against my face, I thought about my father. He'd seen the boom of the 20s, when everyone was buying land and equipment on credit, sure the good times would never end. And he'd seen the bust of the 30s, when the banks failed and the auctioneers came and good men lost everything because they owed more than they owned. "Debt is a wolf, son," he'd told me once, his hands resting on the fender of our old Farmel M. "You can try to make it a pet. You can feed it and think it's your friend. but it's always a wolf, and the day you run out of food, it will eat you. As I looked across the frozen fields toward the new ground Rich Peterson had just bought, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wolf was getting hungry. A small article on the back page of the Prairie Farmer magazine caught my eye one evening. It was about the Federal Reserve and the new chairman, a man I'd never heard of. It talked about fighting inflation, about something called the prime interest rate. It was at 9% now, the article said, and was expected to keep climbing. It was just a little cloud on a bright, sunny horizon, so small that nobody else seemed to even notice it was there. But I did, and I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind rattling the window pane. The good years rolled on, one after another, like smooth, even waves. By 1979, it felt like the high prices and easy credit were the new normal, a permanent feature of the landscape. Rich Peterson's empire had swelled to over 2,000 acres, most of it rented, all of it farmed with the newest, biggest equipment John Deere could produce. He had a matched set of 46 and 40 tractors now, and he'd traded in the 7700 combine for the brand new 8820 model, a true monster, with an 8-row corn head and hydrostatic drive. He even built a new house, a sprawling brick ranch set a quarter-mile off the road, with a long, paved driveway and white fences that looked like they belonged on a horse farm in Kentucky, not a corn farm in Illinois. He was living the dream the university experts and the farm magazines were selling, and he'd become the poster boy for modern, aggressive farming. I kept on as I always had. My 320 acres, my Massey 510, my old but reliable International Harvester tractors. The new siding on my machine shed was the only visible change. The money I'd saved sat in the bank, earning its modest interest, a quiet anchor in a sea of speculative frenzy. In the Beeline Cafe, I was no longer a subject of debate. I was a settled matter, a historical footnote. A good man, they'd say, but one who lacked the vision to seize the moment. I just kept my head down, paid my bills on time, and spent my winters making sure my iron was ready for the spring. The first tremor came not from the sky or the soil, but from the radio. In the winter of 1980, President Carter announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union because of their invasion of Afghanistan. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The market, which had been a raging bull, stumbled, then fell to its knees. Corn prices that had been flirting with $3 a bushel were suddenly struggling to stay above $2. At the co-op, the mood turned grim. The talk of expansion and new equipment vanished, replaced by worried whispers about cash flow and operating loans. For me, it was a hard blow. It meant the difference between a good profit and just breaking even. But for men like Rich Peterson, it was a catastrophe. His entire operation was built on the assumption of high prices. His land payments, his equipment notes, his rent, all those numbers had been calculated in a world of $3 corn. In a world of $2 corn, the math no longer worked. The first visible crack appeared that spring. One of Rich's new 4640s sat idle in his yard for a week. The rumor at the parts counter was that the hydraulic pump had failed, a complex, high-pressure system that was a world away from the simple gear pumps in my old tractors. It wasn't something he could fix himself. It required a dealer technician with specialized diagnostic tools and a service truck. The bill, someone whispered, was over $4,000. $4,000 for a single repair at a time when every penny was precious. That summer, the sky turned against us. A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest and refused to leave. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy, white sky. The corn, which had looked so promising in June, began to suffer. The leaves curled inward during the day, a defensive posture to conserve moisture, giving the fields a sickly, greyish tint. The tassels emerged, weak and pale, shedding their pollen onto silks that were dry and unreceptive. By August, you could hear the corn dying. A hot wind would rustle through the fields, and the sound wasn't the healthy whisper of green leaves, but the dry, brittle rattle of a skeleton. Harvest that year was a grim affair. The yields were cut nearly in half. Rich's massive 8820 combine, designed to swallow 200-bushel corn, moved through the withered fields at a crawl, its huge grain tank taking forever to fill. One afternoon, I saw it stopped dead in the middle of the old Henderson place, the land he'd paid a fortune for. I drove my pickup to the edge of the road. Rich was standing on the ground, staring up at the side of the machine, his hands on his hips. The confident swagger was gone. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I pulled over and walked out to him. "Trouble?" I asked. He barely looked at me. He just gestured at the combine. "The damn thing won't run. Something with the electronics. The header won't lift, and the separator won't engage. Just a blinking red light on the console." I looked at the cab. It was like the cockpit of an airplane, full of rocker switches, digital readouts, and a panel of warning lights. A web of multicolored wires ran in thick bundles under the floor. It was a marvel of technology, but when it broke, it was a mystery locked in a box. "Did you check the fuses?" I asked, the most basic question I could think of. "Of course I checked the fuses, Earl," he snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "It's not a fuse. It's a circuit board, or a solenoid, or God knows what. I called the dealer. They can't get a man out here till tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow afternoon. There's rain in the forecast for Friday." He kicked at a tire, a cloud of bone-dried dust puffing up. "This machine, it has payments bigger than your mortgage used to be. And it's sitting here, dead in the water, waiting for a 20-year-old kid with a laptop to come and bless it." I didn't have any advice to offer him. My Massey had a wiring diagram I could trace with my finger, and its most complex electrical component was the alternator. I knew every nut, bolt, and cotter pin on that machine. He owned this one, but he didn't know it. He was just its operator, and now its prisoner. I nodded. "Well, hope they get it figured out for you." As I walked back to my truck, I felt a pang of something that wasn't pity, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. He had bet the farm on a system he couldn't control, on machines he couldn't fix, on prices he couldn't predict. The wolf was at the door, and he was just now realizing the door was made of paper. The real storm hit that winter. It wasn't a blizzard of snow, but a blizzard of numbers from back east. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, cranked the prime interest rate up to heights no one had ever seen. 10%. 15. 18. It finally peaked at an unbelievable 21.5%. For me, it was good news. The money in my savings account was suddenly earning a fortune in interest. But for anyone with a variable rate loan, it was a death sentence. And every single loan Rich Peterson had taken, for the land, for the combines, for the tractors, for the new house, was a variable rate loan. His payments didn't just go up, they exploded. What was once a manageable, if large, monthly figure became an impossible, terrifying sum. The bank, which had once treated him like a king, now treated him like a liability. The friendly loan officer was replaced by a grim-faced man from the workout department. Suddenly, the talk wasn't about expansion. It was about liquidation. The first auction notice appeared in the local paper in the spring of 1982. It wasn't Rich's farm, but a neighbor's to the south. Then another, and another. It was a plague. Green and red and orange equipment, the pride of generations, lined up in muddy farmyards, tagged with numbers, sold to strangers for pennies on the dollar. Every auction was like a funeral for a farm, and the families stood by like ghosts, watching their lives be dismantled piece by piece. Rich held on longer than most. He sold off one of the 4640s. He let go of all his rented ground. He tried to restructure his debt, but it was like trying to patch a dam with chewing gum. The combination of low prices, a drought-ravaged crop, and crippling interest rates was a wave that couldn't be stopped. The notice for the Peterson Farm auction was posted on a cold, grey day in November. The sale was to be held on the first Saturday of December. It listed everything. The land, all of it, including the Henderson place, the equipment, the mighty 8820 combine, the remaining tractor, the planters, the tillage tools, even the house and its contents, a complete dispersal, the end of the line. My Massey 510 had done its job that fall. The corn was poor, but what was there I got. I ran the machine slow, the concave set wide, the fan speed just so, saving every precious kernel. My bins weren't full, but they were paid for. As I worked, I could see Rich's fields sitting idle. He couldn't afford the fuel to harvest them. The withered stalks stood there all winter, a silent brown monument to a broken dream. My own survival was quiet. I didn't need to borrow a dime for operating expenses that year. I used the savings I had accumulated. While others were being turned away at the co-op for having overdue bills, I paid for my fuel and fertilizer with a check that cleared. I wasn't thriving, not by any measure. But I was holding on. My father's ways, the ways that had seemed so outdated and timid in the 70s, had become a life raft in the 80s. The slow, patient work of maintaining my old iron, the discipline of saving, the deep-seated fear of debt. It had all come to this. It had kept my head above water, while the tide of progress drowned the best and the brightest around me. On the morning of the auction, the sky was the color of lead. A cold wind whipped across the frozen fields, carrying with it the scent of snow. The long paved driveway to Rich's house was packed with pickup trucks, their tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. The crowd was a somber mix of neighbors, bargain hunters, and other farmers who looked like they were there to pay their last respects, their faces etched with the terrifying thought, this could be me. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a big cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice, amplified by a crackling loudspeaker, echoing across the yard. The equipment was lined up in neat rows, clean and polished, like soldiers ready for a final inspection. There was the John Deere 8820, its paint still gleaming, the tires black and new. It was a magnificent machine, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. I saw Rich standing off to one side, near the machine shed his father had built. He was with his wife, and they weren't looking at the crowd. They were looking at the house, their house, where strangers were now poking through their furniture and belongings. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 2. The fire was gone from his eyes. There was just a hollow, empty stillness. I didn't go to gloat. I went because it felt like a duty. A part of me also knew there might be tools or supplies I could pick up for a fair price. I bought a few things. A heavy-duty floor jack, a set of barely used disc blades that would fit my old Oliver disc, a 55-gallon drum of hydraulic oil. Small things, practical things. Then the auctioneer moved to the big items. The 4640 tractor sold for less than half of what it was worth 2 years earlier. The planters and tillage tools went for scrap prices. The crowd was silent, sensing the tragedy of it all. This wasn't just a sale, it was a dissection. Finally they came to the land. They sold it in parcels. His original homestead went first. Then they moved to the Henderson place, the 160 acres of prime black dirt that bordered my own farm on the east. The bidding started low. My heart began to pound. This was the land that had represented the peak of Rich's ambition, the very symbol of his debt-fueled expansion. Buying it felt significant. I thought of my father. I thought of his warning about the wolf. I thought of the bank president telling me I was a fool for putting my money in a savings account. I raised my hand. The auctioneer's eyes found me. Someone else bid. I bid again. It went back and forth, the numbers climbing slowly. But they were nothing like the astronomical price Rich had paid. They were real-world numbers, 80s numbers, reflecting the hard new reality. The other bidder dropped out. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the cold air. "To Earl Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. A few of the old-timers from the cafe nodded at me with a look of profound respect. I felt a tremor in my hands, but my face was calm. I hadn't bought it to be a king. I had bought it because it was good land, it was next to mine, and the price was right. It was a business decision, born of patience and prudence. But I couldn't deny the feeling that rippled through me. It was a quiet, solemn vindication. After the sale was over and the crowd began to thin, I saw Rich still standing by the shed. I walked over to him. He didn't look up. "Rich," I said softly. He finally turned his head, his eyes vacant. "Come to enjoy the show, Earl?" he asked, his voice raspy. "No," I said. "I came to pay my respects. I'm sorry for how this turned out. For you and your family." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You were right. All this time you were right. I thought you were a fool, stuck in the past. But you were the smart one. You saw it coming." "I didn't see it coming," I said honestly. "I just listened to my father. He saw the 30s. He never forgot what debt can do to a man." We stood in silence for a moment, the wind whistling around the corner of the shed. "I bought the Henderson place," I said. He flinched, as if I'd struck him. "Of course you did. Rub it in." "That's not why," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Listen to me. You're a good farmer, Rich. You know how to make corn grow. Your mistake wasn't in the field, it was in the bank. When you get back on your feet, and you will, I'm going to need someone to farm that ground. I'm getting too old to handle another 160 acres by myself. I'll rent it to you. A fair cash rent. No banker involved. Just a handshake between you and me." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was searching my face for mockery, for pity, for the punchline. He found none. He saw only a simple, honest offer. His eyes welled up, and for the first time that day, the hollow look was replaced by a flicker of something else. He nodded, unable to speak, and turned away to hide his face. I put a hand on his shoulder for a moment, then turned and walked back to my truck. The years that followed were lean, but they were manageable. The farm crisis carved a deep scar across the heartland, and our county was never quite the same. Some families left for good. The get big or get out philosophy died a quiet, unceremonious death, replaced by a hard-won wisdom about sustainability and caution. My reputation in the community changed. I was no longer the stubborn old relic. I was the man who had weathered the storm, the one who had been right all along. Younger farmers would stop by my machine shed, asking for advice not about interest rates, but about how to rebuild a carburetor or set the timing on an old diesel engine. Rich took me up on my offer. He and his wife moved into a small rental house in town, and he took a job driving a truck for the co-op. But in the spring, he was out on the Henderson place, farming it with my equipment. He was a changed man, humbled, quieter, but a better farmer than ever. He treated my machinery with a respect born of hard experience. He paid his rent on time, every time. We never became close friends, but a bond of mutual respect formed between us, forged in the crucible of that terrible time. I kept the Massey 510 running well into the late 80s. She was an antique by then, but she never let me down. My son, David, who had gone off to college to study agriculture, came home to farm with me. The first thing I taught him wasn't how to run a planter, but how to change the rasp bars on the old combine. One warm October afternoon, years later, David and I were finishing up the last field of corn on the Henderson place. He was driving the Massey, and I was in the grain truck, waiting to unload. He pulled up alongside, the old Perkins diesel clattering, the whole machine shaking as it idled. He shut down the separator and looked over at me from the operator's seat, a dusting of chaff on his shoulders. "You know, Dad," he yelled over the engine noise, "I was talking to the dealer. They've got a used John Deere 6620 on the lot. Good condition. We could trade this old girl in, get a machine with a cab, maybe even air conditioning." I looked at the old Massey. Her red paint was almost entirely gone, faded to a soft, pinkish rust. The metal was dented and scarred from decades of work, but she was clean, well greased, and running like a top. She represented more than just a piece of equipment. She was a monument to a philosophy. "She's paid for, son," I said, my voice full of a meaning that went far beyond money. "She doesn't owe us a dime, and we don't owe anyone for her. There's a lot of freedom in that. Don't ever forget it." He looked at me, then at the combine, and a slow smile of understanding spread across his face. He nodded, engaged the separator, and pulled back into the standing corn. I stood there on the back of the truck, the smell of diesel and dry corn leaves in the air, and listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of the old machine. It wasn't the roar of progress or the purr of modern technology. It was a different sound altogether. It was the sound of survival, the sound of a legacy, the sound of home.